It was the music that drew me, not the man. I had never met Dr. Leonard Hargreaves, and the small paragraph in the Oxford Mail announcing his passing carried no more personal weight than the day's weather forecast. But they had chosen a Bach cantata for the service, one I had not heard in years, and on a soft February morning in Jericho, that seemed reason enough to put on a tie. The church was sparsely lit, as if the day's grey had been invited inside and given a seat. The stones smelled faintly of damp hymnals and old candle smoke. A few dozen mourners formed an uneven congregation, their voices barely rising during the opening hymn, as though afraid of drawing attention. I slipped into a pew near the back, feeling almost fraudulent, the way one feels at a stranger's wedding. She was impossible not to notice. Tall, dark-haired, standing apart near the front, her gloved hands folded in front of her like something learned from long practice. The profile was cut sharp against the window light, the slope of the nose, the precise turn of the chin, the kind of beauty that remains after fashion has come and gone. She didn't cry, but her hands, black silk against black wool, betrayed her. The smallest tremor ran through them when the organ began the first chord of the cantata. Bach was, as always, immune to circumstance. His music filled the air without deference to grief, and I found myself following the shape of each phrase, the way the voices seemed to lean on each other in the more intricate passages. I wondered, as I often do at such ceremonies, whether the deceased had liked the chosen music or whether it was meant instead for the living, an offering of beauty to soften the harder facts. The eulogy, given by a colleague from St. Luke's, was brief and respectful. Words about scholarship, about the patience required for the slow translation of fragile texts. But there was a careful absence in the speech, a smoothing over where one expects, at least in passing, some sketch of the man's final years. I caught it the way one catches a faint draught in a closed room. After the service, the mourners spilled out into the churchyard. The February air had that smell of thawing earth, and my breath seemed visible only at the edges. I lingered a moment, meaning to approach the widow perhaps, but she was quickly surrounded by two severe-looking women in wool coats, each speaking to her with the flat, slow tone one uses for the newly bereaved. She nodded, but said nothing. I walked toward Walton Street, letting the rhythm of my steps decide whether I would head home or seek a drink. The Jericho Tavern won easily. Inside, the air was thick with the mingled smell of beer and wet coats. I ordered a pint and took it to a corner table near the bar, the sort of position from which one can look without being looked at. Two elderly men sat at the next table, their heads inclined toward one another like conspirators in a medieval panel. They had the Donish look, tweed, thinning hair, and the kind of spectacles that make eyes appear magnified and vaguely amphibian. I caught the low murmur of their voices between the clink of glasses. A shame, really. Should have ended differently. You can't erase something like that, not in Oxford. No, but one might bury it for a while, until death makes the digging easier. A pause, the sound of a match being struck. I never understood why she stayed. Neither did I. Loyalty, perhaps. Or something closer to penance. They noticed me then, or perhaps only the way I seemed to be listening, without quite listening, and their voices fell into harmless talk of college appointments. I finished my pint slowly, the taste of it dull after the music of the morning. Outside, the day had not moved on. The sky still pressed low over the roofs of Jericho, and the puddles along the pavement held a pale reflection of it. I walked without hurry, the widow's profile lodged in my mind, her hands trembling against the weight of Bach. Somewhere in that small tremor, as in the small omission of the eulogy, was the first edge of something I could not yet name. Lewis told me over coffee in the station canteen. The news came in the flat, careful tone of someone aware that a fact once spoken cannot be taken back. The pathologist's report, he said, had ruled out the stroke. Hargreaves had been poisoned. Nothing violent, nothing hurried, but something deliberate enough to end a man in the course of weeks. Slow acting, the report said, the kind of method one imagines from a patient mind. Suspicious, Lewis called it, and of course it was. Hargreaves had been living in the rooms granted to him as an emeritus fellow before marrying late in life. Eleanor. The name felt out of place in my mouth, and I hadn't spoken it aloud yet. 20 years his junior, once his student, I imagined the frowns that would have passed unrecorded in the minutes of high-table dinners. Oxford forgives much, but rarely forgets. I went to St. Luke's that afternoon, less from duty than from the quiet, unspoken curiosity that had already begun to take root. The porter, a man with a face lined like an ordnance map, said the late doctor's rooms had been left untouched for the moment. Mrs. Hargreaves had taken only what she needed. The door opened with a hesitant groan, as though the hinges knew it was no longer expected to do their job. The rooms were small but not mean. Oak desk, a low window overlooking the garden court, and that faint but unmistakable smell of paper, left too long undisturbed. Books lined the walls in orderly ranks, spines sun-faded and softened with use. On the desk lay a single volume, open and face down, as though abandoned mid-thought. Ovid's Metamorphoses in Latin, with the parallel English translation. The edges of the pages had been darkened by the oils of habitual reading, but one passage had been touched more recently, underlined in dark, deliberate strokes. I read the translation: a man deceived, transformed, punished not for what he did, but for what he failed to see. It was not an academic underline. There was something personal in it, the kind of marking one makes not to remember a text, but to keep it close. I stood there longer than I should have, letting the afternoon light shift across the paper. The college clock chimed somewhere beyond the court, its sound softened by the walls. I searched the shelves without touching them, letting my eyes drift over the titles. Tacitus, Homer, a full run of Loeb editions. But there were gaps too, spaces where books had been removed. Perhaps Eleanor had taken them. Perhaps they were elsewhere. Yet the gaps were oddly regular, as if a particular theme had been extracted. I could not name it then, but I felt it. In the garden court below, a young man crossed the lawn with a sheaf of papers under his arm. He looked up briefly toward the window, and in that moment I saw him glance away too quickly, the way people do when they are aware of being observed. A student, I thought, but not at ease here. When I left the rooms, the porter asked whether everything was all right. I said yes, though we both knew the question meant something else. Lewis was waiting in the car. He asked if I had found anything. I told him only about the Ovid, about the underlined passage. He frowned in the polite way one does when unsure if something matters. It may mean nothing, I said, but people do not underline the same way they breathe. They underline for reasons. As we drove away, rain began in the lightest of drizzles, marking the windscreen with hesitant arcs. I watched the spire of St. Luke's fade behind us, the grey stone softening against the low sky. Somewhere between the widow's hands at the funeral and that marked line in Ovid, a shape was beginning to emerge. I could not yet tell if it belonged to the truth or only to my own restlessness. In Oxford, the difference was never as clear as one hoped. By the time I returned to Hargreaves' rooms, the work of erasure had begun. The oak door stood ajar, and the college porter, a man with an affection for unnecessary detail, had stationed himself outside as though guarding a relic that no longer required protection. Inside, the smell was unmistakable, the stale sweetness of pipe tobacco, woven into the deeper scent of paper that had been left to its own quiet decay. The air felt heavy, as if it resisted change. 2 college staff were boxing books from the shelves. They moved with the careful impersonality of people accustomed to dismantling a life without presumption, their hands wrapped in thin cotton gloves. One of them glanced at me as if to confirm my authority to intrude, then turned back to his work. The desk was still in place, a broad slab of dark wood worn to a gloss where elbows had rested for decades. The drawers yielded the predictable, a scattering of fountain pen cartridges, a brass letter opener, the faint residue of tobacco crumbs in a corner. But in the lower drawer there was order, almost too much of it. A neat sequence of envelopes stacked chronologically, all in the same hand. It was the kind of correspondence that tells a story without ever speaking. The gradual evolution of ink colour, the shifting slant of a signature. But there was an interruption. Between February and April of the same year, a gap yawned where one envelope should have been. The edges of the stack were squared as if the absent letter had been removed with precision. People misplace things all the time, but they do not misplace them so neatly. On the mantel stood a framed photograph, its glass dimmed by the years. The St. Luke's Rowing Team, 1972. 8 young men in blazers, the cocks crouched in front. A younger Hargreaves stood at one end, hair longer, expression more open. Beside him, a man whose face I almost recognized. Not immediately, but with that slow, unsettling pull of familiarity, the way one half remembers a tune before its name comes back. I left the frame where it was, but the image stayed with me. The porter lingered in the doorway, clearly waiting for an invitation to speak. When it came, he leaned in as if sharing a confidence. Mrs. Hargreaves, he said, never liked coming here, always seemed in a hurry to be gone, said it smelled too much of the past. I asked how often she had visited. Not often, he replied, and when she did, she stayed by the door. Funny thing for a wife, if you ask me. I did not ask him. When I stepped back into the corridor, the floorboards sighed underfoot, a sound that might once have been comforting in its familiarity. The windows along the passage admitted a dim, diffused light from the quad, where rain had begun to stipple the paving stones. I stood there a moment longer, listening to the muted scrape of books being boxed behind me. A missing letter, a half-familiar face in a photograph, and a woman who avoided the rooms where her husband had spent most of his life. Each detail, by itself, was nothing more than a loose thread. But Oxford has a way of making loose threads part of a larger weave, one you only begin to see when you stop trying to pull at it. I left by the side gate, the porter's voice still drifting after me with some inconsequential story about the college gardens. Outside, the rain was fine enough to be almost invisible, but it settled on my coat all the same, and the stones of St. Luke's glistened faintly under it. I thought again of the man in the photograph, not the young Hargreaves, but the other one, the one whose face sat just out of reach in my memory. Somewhere I was certain I'd seen him before, but the memory, like the missing letter, had been removed with care. Her house stood in one of those North Oxford streets where the trees leaned toward the road as if listening, the kind of place where curtains are drawn early, and even the hedges seem to keep their own counsel. I'd called ahead, a courtesy rather than a necessity, and she had agreed, her voice calm, unhurried. Eleanor Hargreaves opened the door with the air of someone already knowing who it would be. She was dressed simply, the black of mourning softened into a charcoal cardigan, hair drawn back in a way that revealed more of her face than at the funeral. Her eyes, a pale grey, held mine without flinching. We sat in a small sitting room that smelled faintly of fresh polish and something sharper underneath, perhaps the ghost of the tobacco from her late husband's study, or perhaps only my imagination supplying it. On a low table stood a single vase of tulips, their stems angled as though reaching for a sun that would not arrive today. She spoke of Leonard with the careful balance of someone aware her words would be noted. He was a kind man, she said, and then after a pause, a withdrawn one. She did not say this with bitterness, but as a fact, as one might remark on a preference for tea over coffee. Their marriage, she admitted, had not been without its difficulties. He was always working, sometimes even when he was at home. I asked if she had been surprised by his death. Not surprised, she said, but unprepared. There is a difference. I thought I heard in her voice the faintest trace of something, not grief exactly, but the exhaustion that follows it. She offered coffee, and I accepted. The cup she placed before me was thin porcelain, the sort that requires 2 careful fingers. She asked if I took milk, and when I said yes, she moved to the kitchen with an easy, almost studied grace. It was then I noticed the newspaper folded on the arm of her chair, the Times creased neatly, with the crossword half completed in a sharp, fine hand. 2 clues remained unsolved in the lower right corner. My eyes lingered on one of them. Widow's Offering, 5. The other I did not read. The pencil lay across the page, its point dulled. When she returned, she caught my glance but did not comment. I could not decide whether the clue was merely coincidence, or whether she had left it there knowing it would be seen. In Oxford, I have learned, coincidence is a poor thing to trust. The coffee was strong, and we drank it without hurry. I asked about his friends, his colleagues. She answered without embellishment. Some admired him, some envied him. Most kept their distance. She said nothing about the past that might explain the whispers I had overheard in the Jericho Tavern. When I stood to leave, she walked me to the door. The afternoon light had begun to thin, and the hallway felt cooler than when I had arrived. She thanked me for coming, and I believed she meant it, though perhaps for reasons not entirely to do with courtesy. As I stepped out onto the pavement, I found myself turning the crossword clue over in my mind. Widow's offering. 5 letters. The obvious answer came easily enough, but I wondered whether the setter had meant it literally, or whether the offering might be something else entirely, not flowers on a grave, but the withholding of some truth, wrapped carefully and placed where it would be noticed. The trees along the street shivered slightly in the breeze, and the sky above was the colour of old pewter. I walked back toward the centre, the porcelain taste of the coffee still on my tongue, and felt a quiet unease settle in beside me, as if I had left the house carrying more than I had brought in. Lewis found me in the car park, Raymond stippling his coat. He had the look of someone holding a fact that weighed more than it should. 6 months before his death, he said, Hargreaves had altered his will. A substantial sum, more than half his liquid estate, had been redirected from his wife to the saint. Luke's college library. That in itself was unusual, but not unheard of. What was curious was the timing. 6 months before. Quietly done, witnessed by 2 fellows, neither of whom, according to Lewis, had asked the obvious question. I went to the library that afternoon, a place I had visited often in my student days, though for different purposes. The air inside was thick with the scent of old bindings, and the faint metallic tang of the rain-soaked coats hung by the entrance. The reading room was empty, save for a lone student bent over a pile of reference works, the page turning almost reverent in its slowness. Margaret Drayton's office sat behind a heavy oak door at the far end. She was the sort of librarian who seemed to have been born among books, her hair pinned back with the precision of someone who valued both order and economy. Her eyes were sharp but not unkind. She spoke warmly of Hargreaves, of his meticulous habits, of the way he could spend hours tracing the provenance of a single marginal note. He had been, she said, a generous benefactor, though his interest in the library had become particularly intense in the final year of his life. It was then she mentioned, with the careful hesitation of someone unsure how far she should go, the matter of the missing manuscript, a 15th-century devotional text, written in Middle English and bound in cracked calfskin, gone from its shelf sometime in the last year. No forced entry, no trace in the borrowing records. She did not accuse him, her tone made that clear, but there had been words between them. A dispute. After that, she said, he had been quieter when he visited. As she spoke, my attention drifted to a folio lying open on a side table. A rare book, 17th century, its spine fragile but intact. On the flyleaf, an inscription had been scratched out, not with ink, but with a fine, deliberate abrasion, as though someone had sought to erase a name without tearing the page. Under the lamp, I could still make out the faint ghost of the letters. Not the full name, but enough to suggest it had once been personal. She noticed my interest and smiled faintly. We find many curiosities here, Inspector. Some, more easily explained than others. I asked if she had kept a record of who last handled the missing manuscript. She nodded. Of course. But the name, when she read it aloud, was unfamiliar. A graduate student who had left Oxford the previous summer. A dead end, perhaps. When I rose to leave, she offered her hand, her grip surprisingly strong. In the corridor outside, the dim light from the tall windows fell across the parquet in long, uneven bars. Somewhere in the stacks, a book was being reshelved, the muffled thud of it carrying through the hush. Lewis was waiting by the door. I told him about the missing manuscript, about the scratched inscription. He frowned and asked if I thought it was connected to the will. I said only that people rarely change their minds without reason, and rarer still without leaving some trace of it behind. As we stepped out into the quad, the rain had eased, but the stone still shone darkly underfoot. The spire of St. Luke's loomed above us, its silhouette softened by the low, shifting clouds. I thought again of the erased name, and of how, even when the ink is gone, the page remembers. It took longer than I liked to place the face, but when it came, it was obvious. Professor Andrew Selwyn, the sort of academic whose name appears in the broadsheets as easily in the society columns as in the obituaries. A fellow at Queen's, well-published, well-dressed, and, if gossip was to be believed, well-practised in the art of being agreeable. He received me in his rooms on a pale, wind-chased afternoon. The windows looked out over the high, where umbrellas tilted against the weather in hurried procession. His study was warm, the air touched with the perfume of polished wood and something heavier, the open bottle of wine on the sideboard, a burgundy, deep red in the glass, almost too rich for the hour. He poured a measure into a glass and set it down for me without asking. I let it stand. Selwyn was charming in the way certain men are, the easy turn of phrase, the relaxed posture, the impression that nothing you said would surprise him. When I mentioned Leonard Hargreaves, his expression softened into something that might have been regret, though it seemed to me a little rehearsed. "We rode together," he said. "Long time ago? Fine man, but not without his reticence." He paused then, weighing something invisible in the air between us before admitting to a falling out. "Over Eleanor," he said, smiling faintly as if at some private memory. "Long before she married him. The sort of thing one gets over, mostly. Mostly." The word hung there, not quite convincing. I asked if they had spoken in recent years. "Not often," he replied, though there had been the occasional letter. Polite exchanges, nothing more. He did not offer to show them, and I did not press. The conversation slid easily towards safer ground, literature, music, the upcoming college Geordie, but his eyes kept returning to the window, as if measuring how much of the afternoon he was willing to give me. I finished the wine slowly. It was good, too good to rush. When I rose to leave, he walked me to the door with practiced courtesy. As I crossed the gravel path, I glanced back toward his windows. He was already at his desk, head bent, opening a drawer with an urgency absent from our earlier talk. From it, he drew a small leather-bound volume, the size and thickness of a diary, and held it for a moment before turning the key in the desk lock and placing it inside. The gesture was quick, but not quick enough. I could see from where I stood the slight tremor in his hand, the care with which he fitted the key back into his pocket. I walked on, the wind carrying with it the faint toll of a distant bell. Selwyn had spoken as if the past were neatly contained, filed away like one of his papers. But the movement I had just witnessed was not the movement of a man content to leave things behind. There is a look people get when they touch an object that matters to them. Not sentiment exactly, but possession. I'd seen it before in courtrooms and in college rooms, in lovers and in thieves. The street narrowed toward the corner, the pavement slick with the day's thin rain. I thought of Eleanor, of the missing letter from Hargreaves's drawer, of the erased name in the library's folio, and now a locked diary in the rooms of a man who claimed to have moved on. Oxford is a city of locks, and most of them are opened eventually, some with keys, some without. The King's Arms was half full that evening, its air warmed by the low murmur of conversation and the smell of spilled ale seeping into wood grain. I had not gone there for Selwyn, though I found him at the far end of the bar, flanked by two younger dons whose admiration was obvious in their laughter. He held court with ease, glass in hand, his voice carrying just enough for the rest of us to hear without quite being invited into the circle. It was the tail end of a story, and he finished it with a flourish that bled into a quotation. "Tennyson," he said, voice mellowed by the wine I suspected he'd been drinking since lunch. "It is better to have loved and lied than never to have loved at all." His companions chuckled, as though the neat cynicism were the poet's own. But it wasn't, and I knew it the moment he said it. The real line, from In Memoriam, lay buried somewhere in the dustier shelves of my mind. It is better to have loved and lost than never to have loved at all. A small alteration, but one that changed the sentiment entirely, turning elegy into something closer to admission. I left without speaking to him, the phrase turning itself over in my head as I walked back through the damp streets toward home. Misquotation is rarely accidental among men like Selwyn. Words are chosen, weighted, and in that weighting, meaning leaks through. Later, I pulled my copy of In Memoriam from the shelf, a second-hand volume with a cracked spine and the faint smell of pipe smoke pressed into its pages. I found the original line easily enough, and reading it again, I felt the distance between loss and lie stretch wide. Selwyn's version seemed less the result of a fading memory than a deliberate nudge, a reframing of sentiment into something darker. It sat in the mind like a stone. By morning, the idea had taken a sharper edge. A man who could so casually rework a line about love and loss might also be capable of recasting the facts of a death. I began to wonder if the falling out with Hargreaves, the locked diary, the carefully measured charm were all threads in the same weave. Poisoning requires patience, discretion, and perhaps a capacity for misquotation. The suspicion had barely settled when Lewis arrived with a file under his arm, and the sort of look that precedes a correction. He'd been checking Selwyn's movements in the weeks leading up to Hargreaves's death. University records, travel documents, passport stamps, the lot. And there it was. Selwyn had been in Florence, attending a conference, and had stayed on for nearly a month afterward. The dates covered the crucial period when the poison, whatever it was, must have been administered. Lewis looked almost apologetic when he told me. Abroad the whole time. Witnesses to prove it. Hotel receipts. Even a paper he gave at the conference. It is one of the more irritating aspects of detection that a theory, once elegant in the mind, can dissolve into nothing in the space of a sentence. The misquoted Tennyson remained curious, but it was now a curiosity without the weight I had hoped for. A red herring, and a vivid one, sliding back into the depths. Still, I couldn't quite shake the image of Selwyn at the bar, rolling the altered line across his tongue like good wine. Men sometimes reveal themselves obliquely, and not always in ways that make them guilty of the crime in question. But guilt is not the only thing worth noting. That night, I left the book open on my desk, the correct line underlined in pencil. Better to have loved and lost. The word lost seemed suddenly the more dangerous of the two. The rain had given way to a thin winter sunlight when Lewis brought me the name. One of those curious connections that the years seem to preserve in Oxford like pressed flowers in a book. A Mr. Peter Wainwright, now a schoolteacher in Abingdon, had rung in after hearing a scrap of news about the case. He'd been a choir boy at the college chapel in the mid-1980s and thought he might have something. His tone, Lewis said, had been tentative, the sort of voice that belonged to someone unsure whether a memory counted as a fact. We met in a small staff room smelling faintly of chalk dust and tea gone cold. Wainwright was in his 40s, neatly dressed in the way of men who spend their days standing in front of children, his manner cautious but not unfriendly. I sang in the choir when Dr. Hargreaves was senior. "Fellow," he began. We all knew him, in the way boys do, by the sound of his cough in the cloisters, the smell of his pipe, and we knew his wife too. Mrs. Hargreaves was different from the Dons' wives. She had a sort of quiet elegance. The boys noticed. He smiled faintly at the recollection, then seemed to steady himself. There's one night that stayed with me. We were leaving after evensong, must have been late autumn because it was dark by 6:30, and I had to fetch a hymn book I'd left in the library anteroom. As I came back through the main library, I saw the Hargreaveses. Not unusual in itself, except it was late and the place was nearly empty. Mrs. Hargreaves was at one of the high shelves, running her fingers along the spines. Dr. Hargreaves was at the desk, speaking in low tones to Mr. Turner, the librarian. They didn't see me. He hesitated, as if the next part required an effort to say. I remember, quite distinctly, Mrs. Hargreaves taking down a very old-looking book. She opened it, glanced around, then slipped something into her coat pocket. Just a folded piece of paper. She closed the book and put it back quickly. I didn't think much of it at the time. I was 12. Paper from a book seemed harmless enough. "Did you recognize the book?" I asked. Number, but it was in the rare book section, the high shelves near the east windows. You needed permission to handle those volumes. Mr. Turner was particular about it. I pressed him gently for details. The coat was dark. The paper had been yellowed at the edges. Eleanor's movement had been brisk, almost practiced. He had told no one, not even his parents, partly out of instinct, partly because in the miniature world of a choir boy, adults' affairs were like distant weather, felt but not questioned. As Wainwright spoke, I felt the axis of the case begin to tilt again. The image of Eleanor's gloved hand sliding a folded paper from an ancient book was more than an eccentric habit. It was furtive, purposeful, and if the paper was what I suspected, a letter, a document, something of value to her, then it might explain more than one mystery. When I left the school, the streets of Abingdon seemed caught in that brittle brightness that comes after rain. My mind was less clear. I'd spent the last week circling Selwyn like a wary dog around a stranger, only to have him slip cleanly from the frame. And now Eleanor Hargreaves, whom I had, in weaker moments, almost pitied, stepped quietly back into the foreground. Back in Oxford, I walked to the Bodleian out of habit, threading through the corridors to the college library's east window. The rare bookshelves stood as Wainwright had described them, high, shadowed, their leather spines mottled with age. The air there carried the dry, faintly sweet scent of old paper and dust. One could believe almost anything hidden in such a place might remain undisturbed for decades. I ran my hand along the spines, imagining Eleanor's fingers tracing the same line 30 years ago, pausing, selecting, concealing. Whatever she had taken, and whatever it meant, had been important enough to risk the librarian's notice. The memory of a 12-year-old choir boy is not evidence in itself, but it was enough to sharpen the edges of my suspicion. I left the library with a list of rare volumes from that shelf, determined to see which, if any, might yield the ghost of a folded page. Somewhere between the yellowed paper of the past and the poison of the present, I felt the widow's shadow lengthen. The morning began with a dusting of frost across the college quad, that thin, almost translucent kind which vanishes by the time you've thought to notice it. I was in the archive by 9, a place whose quiet was different from the library's, heavier, almost expectant. The archivist, Miss Carrow, had a voice like a closing drawer and a briskness that suggested the centuries were hers to guard. I told her I was following up on an anomaly in the rare books catalogue, a reference to correspondence lodged in the Selwyn collection, but last seen, according to a pencilled note from 1991, in Miscellaneous Latin MSS, Drawer 3. She pursed her lips, fetched a ring of keys, and led me down a narrow corridor smelling of cold stone and beeswax. Drawer 3 was stubborn. The brass handle stuck, then gave with a sigh, revealing a row of thin leather folders bound with fading tape. Inside the third folder, between 2 sermons of no interest to anyone but the devoutly dead, lay a single envelope. It was unremarkable except for the ink, a brownish black, written in the confident, slightly florid hand I recognized from Hargreaves's undergraduate essays. The date, 14th March 1956, placed it in his final year at the university. The recipient's name had been scratched out so forcefully the paper was scored. Inside, the letter ran to 3 pages, though at first glance it appeared to be an exercise in literary affectation, a series of lines drawn from various Latin poets, stitched together without obvious sense. I took it to a reading table beneath the high window and began the slow work of unpicking it. Latin was an old ally of mine, a fading friendship, but not a forgotten one. Within half an hour, the pattern began to emerge. The lines were not quoted exactly, but altered. A verb tense shifted here, an adjective replaced there, so that the first letter of each altered word spelled out a message. When I wrote it down, the confession stood stark against the pale paper. I took it. The Ovid translation is not mine. I copied from the notes of J.R.W. He never knew. I won the prize. It was a small scandal in the grand sweep of things, but for a young scholar in the 1950s, the theft of another man's work, especially one that had secured him the Craven Prize, would have been enough to ruin his career before it began. And Hargreaves, whatever else he became, had built his life on the bedrock of reputation. I sat back, letting the cold air from the window touch my face. The implications unfurled slowly. Eleanor Hargreaves, then Eleanor Price, if memory served, had been at the college as a junior librarian in the 1980s. If she had come across this letter, tucked into the wrong folder, she would have held in her hands a quiet, devastating piece of leverage. With it, she could have ensured her security, a place in his life, however reluctantly granted. And when, decades later, he decided to cut her from his will, the same knowledge might have fermented into something darker. Revenge, after all, is a dish served best from long memory. The archivist returned, her hands tucked into the sleeves of her cardigan. "Find what you were after?" she asked. I closed the folder carefully. "More or less," I said. "This should probably be returned to the Selwyn collection." Her eyebrows lifted a fraction, but she nodded. In the archive, the past is not so much guarded as tolerated, and one doesn't disturb it unnecessarily. Outside, the frost had melted, leaving the quad damp and smelling faintly of earth. I walked back to my rooms, the letter's words pressing at my mind like a half-heard chorus. In the matter of the poisoned sherry, the trail now curved once more towards Eleanor Hargreaves. If she had once used the past to shape her future, what would stop her from using the present to avenge it? And yet, there was still the question of how, precisely, she had slipped the poison into Selwyn's glass without anyone seeing. Knowledge was power, yes, but in murder, knowledge had to be matched with opportunity. The game, as always, was far from over. The rain had been falling since noon, a fine, slanting drizzle that blurred the outlines of Jericho's brick terraces and left the air smelling faintly of coal smoke. The tavern sat on the corner of a narrow street, its windows steamed and its low-beamed ceiling pressing down on the conversation within. I'd chosen it deliberately, the same place where, weeks ago, I had first overheard the rumours that had led me here. Eleanor Hargreaves arrived precisely on time, her umbrella dripping in the doorway. She wore a dark wool coat and a small silver brooch in the shape of a quill. There was something composed about her, as though the years had taught her to walk into any room already knowing where she'd sit. We found a table in the corner, the old oak scarred by years of tankards and careless matches. The barman brought 2 glasses of a Côte du Rhône that had seen better vintages, but was warm enough to take the chill from our hands. "You wanted to talk about Leonard," she said, her voice even. "About a letter," I replied. "A misfiled one, hidden, perhaps, in plain sight, written in code using scraps of Latin poetry." A flicker, almost imperceptible, passed over her face. Not surprise, but recognition. I set the photocopy between us, the original safely returned to the archive. "It's quite a clever construction," I said. "A confession of plagiarism. Leonard's, in his final year. The sort of thing that could have ended him before he began." She traced the edge of the paper with one finger, not reading, simply feeling the texture. "He was very proud of that prize," she said at last. "So proud," I said, "that his greatest fear was not death but disgrace." I let the words hang there, their weight unsoftened. "You worked in the college library in the 80s. You could have come across this letter then. Kept it, used it." Her eyes lifted to meet mine. They were clear, steady, almost curious, as though she were watching to see how far I would go. "What exactly are you accusing me of, Inspector?" "Of being in the library late at night, the week before Leonard's death," I said. "The porter saw you leave. You said you'd been looking for a misplaced book. Perhaps you were looking for this." She took a sip of wine, unhurried. "Leonard and I had an understanding," she said finally. "But understandings have a way of changing over time. He changed the terms. And you?" "I adapted." It wasn't an admission, nor was it a denial. Her tone was almost conversational, as if we were discussing the weather. She set down her glass and leaned back slightly. "Leonard lived his life terrified that someone would discover he wasn't as brilliant as they thought. That fear shaped him, far more than love or ambition or loyalty. Death was nothing compared to that." Her gaze lingered on me for a moment, then she smiled, the smallest curve of the lips, and stood. "Thank you for the wine, Inspector." By the time I stepped outside, she was already halfway down the street, her umbrella bobbing in the rain. Lewis was waiting by the car, hands in his pockets, the shoulders of his coat glistening with damp. "Well?" he asked. "Are we arresting her?" I looked past him to Walton Street, where the wet tarmac shone under the orange glow of the street lamps. Rainwater traced quicksilver paths along the gutters. Somewhere down the road a cyclist's bell rang, sharp and fleeting. I thought of the letter, of the porter's sighting, of the poisoned sherry. I thought of Eleanor's voice, calm, controlled, untouched by panic, and I thought of the gap between knowing a thing and proving it. "Not tonight," I said. Lewis followed my gaze. "You think she did it?" I didn't answer. The rain made small, steady percussion on the car roof, and the smell of wet stone and smoke filled the air. In Jericho, secrets didn't dissolve in water. They sank deeper. The coroner's court was sparsely attended, the kind of half-forgotten proceeding that seemed destined to be tucked away on page 6 of the Oxford Mail. The rain that had haunted the city all week had given way to a pale, hard sunlight that made the dust on the courtroom windows stand out in sharp relief. The verdict, open, was delivered with the usual solemnity, though it had been clear from the outset that it could hardly be otherwise. There was no conclusive evidence of foul play, no irrefutable link between the traces of poison and any single person. The coroner's voice was measured, almost weary. The cause of death remains unproven, and the question of intent unresolved. Eleanor Hargreaves was not present for the final statement. She had left Oxford 2 days earlier, a single suitcase loaded into the boot of a waiting taxi. A porter at her college had said she was going to the coast, though he could not say which one. A faint smell of her perfume still lingered in the library office she had once occupied. Selwyn, the college's aging librarian, retired without ceremony a week later. The fellows were told it was due to personal health concerns. No farewell gathering was held, no speeches given. The man simply vanished into the long corridor of past college officials, whose portraits hung in the dining hall, their names remembered by few. It was Lewis who told me about the manuscript. He found it while delivering a file back to the library. It had been slipped quietly onto the shelf where it had once belonged. No note, no explanation. The cataloguing slip bore no sign of fresh ink or amendment, as though it had never been missing at all. The day I learned of its return, I walked through the college at dusk. The quad lay in that peculiar light, where the last colour drains from the sky, but the lamps have yet to fully claim the darkness. A breeze carried the faint scent of wet leaves from the gardens, and the flagstones beneath my feet were slick from a shower earlier in the afternoon. The great oak doors to the chapel stood ajar, spilling a narrow band of amber light onto the grass. Somewhere inside, the choir was rehearsing a psalm, their voices blurred by the evening air. I paused, listening. The college had resumed its rhythms as it always did, students hurrying to hall, the clink of cutlery from the kitchens, the rustle of gowns in stairwell shadows. The death of Leonard Hargreaves, like so many scandals before it, was already settling into the soft sediment of Oxford memory. I had, in my coat pocket, a torn scrap from the Times crossword, a clue that had taunted me for days. Widow's offering. 5. I'd idly speculated about coins, candles, even poppies. Now, in the empty quad, I stopped walking. It came to me with the quiet satisfaction of a long-delayed truth. Alibi. Of course. A widow's offering. Not flowers for the grave, but a story for the living. One that might shield or shift suspicion. I turned the word over in my mind, its symmetry, its peculiar neatness. And then I thought of Eleanor, her calm voice in the Jericho Tavern, her careful avoidance of either denial or confession, an alibi, yes, not to free herself entirely, but to leave the matter adrift beyond the reach of law. For a moment, I felt the corner of my mouth lift. Not quite a smile, but the shadow of one. As the last of the light slipped from the sky, I crossed the quad, the sound of my steps echoing faintly against the old stone. Somewhere beyond the city, the tide would be breaking against a distant shore, and Eleanor Hargreaves would be watching the water. Here in Oxford, the bells of the chapel began to toll the hour, slow and deliberate, marking the end of a case that had never quite begun, and the end, too, of a certain question in my mind. Not an answer, not exactly, but something close enough. The rain had returned by nightfall, a steady, patient drizzle that slicked the pavements and turned the street lamps outside my window into blurred halos of amber. I'd left my coat on the arm of the chair, the faint smell of damp wool seeping into the warm air of the flat. Mozart was playing, the slow movement from the Piano Concerto No. 21, that long, unhurried line of melody that seems to suspend time without ever quite stopping it. I had chosen it deliberately, though I wasn't entirely sure why. Perhaps it was the balance between sadness and grace, or perhaps it was simply because it filled the room without demanding anything in return. I poured the last measure of a Highland single malt into the glass. The whisky caught the lamplight in its gold-brown depths, a quiet echo of the autumn leaves that clung stubbornly to the trees along Walton Street. The first sip burned, then softened, as the music swelled gently, and the rain whispered against the window. Eleanor. I could still see her in the corner of that Jericho Tavern, the measured tilt of her head, the faint lift of an eyebrow at my questions, the unbroken calm in her voice. She had not lied, not exactly. She had simply given me fragments, enough to form a picture, but not the whole, an absence as deliberate as any confession. Her intelligence was formidable, her self-possession absolute. There was a kind of beauty in it, though not the kind that fades with time or dim light. It was in the precision of her words, the way she could say nothing and yet leave one with the uneasy sense of having heard too much. Could she have done it? Of course, but so could others. The truth, the whole truth, was beyond reach now, buried somewhere between the library stacks, the quiet corridors of the college, and the salt air of whatever coast she had chosen. Lewis had asked me once, not long after the inquest, whether I thought she was guilty. I had said something evasive, something about the limits of evidence. But here, in the solitude of my flat, with Mozart and whiskey for company, I admitted to myself that I did not know, and worse, that a part of me preferred not to. The concerto's theme returned, slower now, dissolving into its own reflection. The rain kept its quiet rhythm, each droplet a soft punctuation against the glass. I closed my eyes, letting the sound of the piano carry me somewhere between memory and forgetting. There was a line, from Ovid, I think, that had been drifting in and out of my thoughts for days. I'd first read it years ago, scrawled in the margin of an old textbook in the Bodleian. I murmured it aloud now to the empty room, the words tasting of Latin and peat smoke. I am the same, though changed. The glass was nearly empty. The music was fading. Beyond the window, the street lamps gleamed on wet stone, and the city lay quiet under its veil of rain. I sat back in the chair, listening to the last notes vanish into the air, and wondered, not for the first time, whether certainty was ever more than an illusion. Some cases ended with a name, an arrest, a conviction. Others ended like this, with a half smile in a Jericho tavern, a manuscript returned without explanation, and a widow walking away into the rain. The record reached its end. The needle lifted with a soft click. And for a moment, before I reached for another record or another glass, there was nothing but the quiet and the memory of eyes that had never once looked away.